Would you go against your community and stand up for what you believed in? Would you tell the figures of authority around you they were doing wrong? And if so, how would you do it? John Woolman did stand up, taking a radical stance on slavery, wealth, oppression, luxuries, and even dyed clothing. He was born to a Quaker family in the year 1720 and died in 1772 while traveling in England as a preacher. In 1754 and 1762, he published the two-part book, Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, a skillfully argued call for abolition. His journal, published 2 years after his death, chronicles his internal development and the years of dedication to his beliefs. While working for a small shop owner, he recounts, "My employer, having a Negro woman, sold her and desired me to write a bill of sale, the man being waiting who bought her. The thing was sudden, and though I felt uneasy at the thought of writing an instrument of slavery for one of my fellow creatures, yet I remembered that I was hired by the year, that it was my master who directed me to do it, and that it was an elderly man, a member of our society, who bought her. So through weakness I gave way and wrote it. But at the executing of it, I was so afflicted in my mind that I said before my master and a friend that I believed slave keeping to be a practice inconsistent with the Christian religion." This was John's first direct dealing with the slave trade, and being a young man, he was carried along with the pressure to conform. However, he was soon presented with another opportunity. A person at some distance lying sick, his brother came to me to write his will. I knew he had slaves, and asking his brother, was told he intended to leave them a slave to his children. As writing is a profitable employee, and as offending sober people was disagreeable to my inclination, I was straitened in my mind. But as I looked to the Lord, he inclined my heart to his testimony. I told the man that I believed the practice of continuing slavery to this people was not right, and that I had a scruple in my mind against doing writings of that kind, that though many in our society kept them as slaves, I still was not easy to be concerned in it, and desired to be excused from going to write the will. We can all agree it's hard to go against the group, especially when you are young, and John wrote about this. "Nor is it a pleasant thing for a young man to be under any necessity to question the judgment or honesty of elderly men, and more especially as such as have a fair reputation. Deep-rooted customs, though wrong, are not easily altered, but it is the duty of all to be firm in that which they certainly know is right for them." About this time, an ancient man of good esteem in the neighborhood came to my house to get his will written. He had young Negroes, and I asked him privately how he purposed to dispose of them. I then said, "I cannot write thy will without breaking my own peace," and respectfully gave him my reasons for it. A few years after, there being great alterations in his family, he came back to get me to write his will. His Negroes were yet young, and his son, to whom he intended to give them. We had so much friendly talk on the subject, and then deferred it. A few days after, he came again and directed their freedom, and then I wrote his will. Near the time that last mentioned friend first spoke to me, a neighbor received a bad bruise on his body, and sent for me to bleed him, which having done, he desired me to write his will. I took notes, and amongst other things he told me, to which of his children he gave his Negro. I considered the pain and distress he was in, and knowing not how it would end, so I wrote his will, save only the part concerning his slave, and carried it to his bedside, read it to him. I then told him in a friendly way that I could not write any instruments by which my fellow creatures were made slaves. We then had a serious conference on the subject. At length he agreed to set her free, and I finished his will. As we can see, through perseverance, he managed to convince several people to free their slaves. As time went on, his convictions got stronger and stronger, and he began traveling as a preacher to spread his beliefs. When visiting the members of the Society of Friends, it was custom for preachers or ministers to be welcomed into their homes cost-free. However, John writes, "When I ate, drank, and lodged free cost with people who lived in ease on the hard labor of their slaves, I felt uneasy. I saw in the southern provinces so many vices and corruptions increased by this trade and this way of life. Determined not to benefit in any way from slavery, John decided to pay for his room and board. I should be enabled even to leave money with the members of the society where I had entertained. When I expected soon to leave a friend's house, I spoke to one of the heads of the family privately and asked them to accept those pieces of silver and give them to such of their negroes as they believed would make the best use of them, and at other times I gave them to the negroes myself." It is clear that this was uncomfortable for him as well as his hosts, but he was resolute in his decision. At one point during his travels, John is camping with some fellow travelers when he hears one of them complain about the slothful disposition of the negroes, adding that one of our laborers would do as much in a day as two of their slaves. I replied that free men, whose minds were probably on their business, found a satisfaction in improving, cultivating, and providing for their families. But Negroes, laboring to support others who claim them as their property and expecting nothing but slavery during life, had not the like inducement to be industrious. One of the men tries to argue that the slaves bear the mark of Cain, but John, being a preacher, quickly shows them the error in that argument. The love of ease and gain are the motives in general of keeping slaves, and men are wont to take hold of weak arguments to support a cause which is unreasonable. I have no interest on either side, save only the interest which I desire to have in truth. I believe liberty is their right, and I see they are not only deprived of it, but treated in other respects with inhumanity in places. He briefly talks about the conditions of the slaves which he cannot abide, mentioning practices such as the parting of husband and wife by selling one to a faraway buyer, as well as the hiring of an overseer with a whip to drive the slaves on and administer severe punishments. Most slaves had barely enough clothes to cover their nakedness, and their children ran naked. Some Quakers, he says, taught their slaves to read, but in general it was not only neglected but disapproved of. Woolman was trained as a tailor and in merchandising, which I understand as having a small store, as well as his work writing documents. However, he reaches a point where he realizes that his time and his thoughts are being swallowed by his businesses. He eventually closes his store and relies entirely on tailoring, so as to be able to concentrate more fully on his minister and missionary work. Where the heart was set on greatness, success in business did not satisfy the craving, but that commonly with an increase of wealth, the desire of wealth increased. It occurred to me some time ago that I feel a pressure to view all ideas through the prism of capitalism. Any new project or ideas must make money. Even if they cost little themselves, they take time away from other money-making activities. I think as a species, we have gone astray with the excesses of capitalism. Often the profit motive eclipses human well-being. Even the most successful are often very stressed out and short of time. He looked out with a mingled feeling of wonder and sorrow upon the hurry and unrest of the world, and especially he was pained to see luxury and extravagance overgrowing the early plainness and simplicity of his own religious society. Where people let loose their minds after the love of outward things and are more engaged in pursuing the profits, their examples are often hurtful to others, and their treasures, thus collected, do many times prove dangerous snares to their children. At one point, he begins to philosophize whether or not actions can ever truly be selfless, or are we always deep down motivated by some personal interest? If I go on a visit to the widows and fatherless, do I go purely on a principle of charity? free from any selfish views. If I go to a religious meeting, it puts me on thinking whether I go in sincerity and in a clear sense of duty, or whether it is not partly in the conformity to custom, or partly from a sensible delight which my animal spirits feel in the company of other people, and whether to support my reputation as a religious man has no share in it. This is a good question. Every act of goodwill can be seen as an attempt to gain the favor of God. At the end of the day, it is better to be good, selflessly or not, rather than being selflessly bad, if that is even possible. As Benjamin Franklin argued, many religious commandments or prohibitions have their own intrinsic value to human happiness. Woolman also came to reject all forms of luxuries, including silverware, sugar, and even dyed clothing. We cannot go into superfluities or grasp after wealth in a way contrary to his wisdom, without having connection with some degree of oppression, and with that spirit which leads to self-exaltation and strife. Thinking often on these things, the use of hats and garments dyed with a dye hurtful to them, and wearing more clothes in the summer than are useful, grew more uneasy to me, believing them to be customs which have not their foundation in pure wisdom. The apprehension of being singular from my beloved friends was a strain upon me, and thus I continued in the use of some things contrary to my judgment. This guy was a real nonconformist. Imagine living in a religious community back then that made up about 30% of the US population, and they all dress the same, but you decide you're going to dress differently. He worried about being singled out, but he had the balls to stand up for his beliefs and do it anyway. In attending meetings, this singularity was a trial to me, and more especially at that time, as white hats were used by some who were fond of following the changeable modes of dress, and as some friends who knew not what motives I wore it grew shy of me, and I felt my way for a time shut up in the exercise of the ministry. This forces us to ask, would we do the same? Would we be brave enough? It's easy to say yes, but perhaps a more interesting question is, have we ever failed to do so in the past? Woolman even rejected superfluous activities, such as the time a juggler or a magician came to his town. Life in the New World was not easy, filled with toil and danger. Access to cultural arts, such as the theatre or even books, must have been very hard to come by. So it seems a shame to deny the townspeople access to a magic show from time to time. Imagine a world where Ben Franklin had not witnessed the first parlor tricks with static electricity. Perhaps he would never have begun experimenting in that science, depriving the world of its many advancements. Woolman's reasoning for renouncing luxuries was partly due to their being linked directly to slavery, such as sugar, as well as his beliefs on vanity. Does pride lead to vanity? Does vanity form imaginary wants? Do these wants prompt men to exert their power in requiring more from others than they would be willing to perform themselves? Were the same required of them? Do these proceedings beget hard thoughts? Do hard thoughts, when ripe, become malice? Does malice, when ripe, become vengeful, and in the end inflict terrible pains on our fellow creatures and spread desolations in the world? These questions paint a slippery slope that I can see as quite plausible. Being proud leading to vanity, vanity leading to the need to acquire more and more status signaling possessions, an inflated ego suppressing empathy, exploiting more and more the world around you, real or imagined resentment and envy felt from others, soon fueling dark thoughts. Towards the end of his life, Woolman felt the calling to continue preaching his beliefs in England. Leaving his friends and family, he set out to book passage on a ship, but was unable to accept lodging in the cabins normally reserved for passengers. Instead, he chose to berth with the common seamen before the mast, and during the voyage he became very fond of the seamen, especially the young boys. He saw their poor conditions as another example of the oppression caused by greed. I have often perceived that with a view to get riches and to provide estates for children, that they may live comfortably to the customs and honours of this world, many are entangled in the spirit of oppression. But how lamentable is the present corruption of the world! How impure are the channels through which trade is conducted! How great is the danger to which poor lads are exposed when placed on shipboard to learn the art of sailing. His writing on this subject reminds me of a fascinating book, 2 Years Before the Mast, written by Richard Henry Danner. That book is also part of the Harvard Classic series, so hopefully we'll get to that soon. Once Woolman arrives in England, he is greatly affected by the poverty and the oppression that he perceives. Great numbers of poor people live chiefly on bread and water in the southern parts of England, as well as in the northern parts, and there are many poor children not even taught to read. May those who have abundance lay these things to heart. Talking about the stagecoaches in England, that is common for horses to be killed with hard driving, and that many others are driven till they grow blind. Postboys pursue their business, each one to his stage, all night through the winter. Some boys who ride long stages suffer greatly in winter nights, and at several places I have heard of their being frozen to death. So great is the hurry in the spirit of this world, that aiming to do business quickly and to gain wealth, the Creator at this day doth loudly groan. Having heard about the exploitation of the postboys, Woolman told his family and friends not to send him any mail while he was in England. He refused to board any stagecoaches and presumably walked from town to town. It is clear Woolman's faith is incredibly profound, and in this edition of the book, he writes about 2 visions he had. The first vision, he awoke alone one night to see a light in my chamber at the apparent distance of 5 foot, about 9 inches in diameter, of a clear, easy brightness, and near its centre the most radiant. As I lay still, looking upon it without any surprise, words were spoken in my inward ear, which filled my whole inward. They were not the effect of thought, nor any conclusion in relation to the appearance, but as the strange language of the Holy One spoken in my mind. The words were, certain evidence of divine truth. They were again repeated exactly in the same manner, and then the light disappeared. The second vision was when he was struck by a dreadful fever and came close to death. I was brought so near to the gates of death that I forgot my name. I saw a mass of matter of a dull, gloomy colour between the south and the east, and was informed that this mass was human beings in as great misery as they could be, and that I was mixed with them, and that henceforth I might not consider myself as a distinct or separate being. In this state I remained several hours. I then heard a soft, melodious voice, more pure and harmonious than any I had heard with my ears before. I believed it was the voice of an angel who spoke to the other angels. The words were, John Woolman is dead. I soon remembered that I was once John Woolman. I was then carried in spirit to the mines, where poor oppressed people were digging rich treasures for those called Christians, and heard them blaspheme the name of Christ, at which I was grieved, for his name to me was precious. I was then informed that these heathens were told that those who oppressed them were the followers of Christ, and they said among themselves, if Christ directed them to use us in this sort, then Christ is a cruel tyrant. The Quakers were extreme pacifists, and one sentence really jumped out to me. It requires great self-denial and resignation of ourselves to God to attain that state wherein we can freely cease from fighting when wrongfully invaded, if by our fighting there were a probability of overcoming the invaders. This is an extreme take on pacifism. The Quakers went to great lengths to avoid all dealings with conflict, even trying to avoid paying taxes that were used for war. However, 100 years later, once the Quakers had fully embraced anti-slavery values, they were forced to choose between anti-slavery and pacifism during the Civil War. This was the first time members of the Society of the Friends were authorized to bear arms in support of the war effort. I was very surprised to learn that in the first editions of his journals, published after his death, almost all mention of his anti-slavery beliefs were removed. They did this to protect the many Quakers who held slaves at that time. I cannot imagine what would be left in the book after taking all these anti-slavery sentiments out, as the book is extremely repetitive, mentioning visiting friends who held slaves and weighty conversations over and over again. As abolition sentiments became more popular throughout the country, his journals were republished in new editions with more and more of his anti-slavery writings. I was also disappointed to learn that he originally wrote about many more visions. Unfortunately, only 2 were included in this edition, which I think is a real shame. It is worth taking a moment to think about how long it took for his beliefs to be generally accepted. He died in 1772, just 4 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An idea we take for granted now, written in 1776, had a civil war fought over it in 1861, and the civil rights movement marked by Martin Luther King's death in 1968, some 200 years later. This is the second book in the Harvard Classic series, and to be honest, as valuable and inspiring as John Woolman's writings and sentiments are, I found it much harder to read than Ben Franklin's autobiography. His writing style is very repetitive and ambiguous, and I would have loved to read a lot more about what he saw and experienced throughout his travel, and how he learned to confront people about changing their beliefs and actions that they surely did not want to change. However, I can see why this book is so important. It provides us an example we should all resolve to follow. Think hard about what our values are and stand up for them when the opportunity arises. The next book in the series is William Penn's Fruits of Solitude. From what I've read already, this promises to be a great book full of wisdom and thought-provoking ideas. So, you guys know the score. Push the buttons, help us grow, and I'll see you next week.